Right, so this title is a little bit more clickbaity than I normally like, but it is still largely an accurate description of what it is that I'm covering here. Recent news fits nicely with the concept I had for a video beforehand, and it is very much related to the topic I discussed in my previous video on addressing employment precarity. So, Bernie Sanders has just announced two plans intended to shift control away from corporations into the hands of American workers. Recently, the Washington Post had a good article on this, and I recommend that you check it out. I have a link in the description. Additionally, both Vox and New York Magazine have good articles that I'll also reference a bit and link in the description. I mentioned the WAPO article first, mostly because I read it first. So, these two proposals are different but very much are related in that they empower workers. The first one I'll mention quickly because it's a good one. It's not, though, quite as revolutionary. Elizabeth Warren is already running on a similar plan. This proposal is known as co-determination. It involves giving employees the right to worker representatives on the board of directors of the corporation they work for. Warren's plan, for example, would require that 40% of the board of directors in corporations with revenue over $1 billion would have to be made up of worker-elected representatives. Bernie has yet to release specifics as of recording this, but I imagine it'd be similar. It's a pretty good idea that I'll probably talk about in another video, but it isn't the main event. The second, which I'll do a deeper dive into, is much more radical, yet can be sold on a pretty moderate basis, as the New York Magazine article correctly points out. Bernie's plan here would mandate large businesses contribute a portion of their stocks into an employee-controlled fund. This fund would be used to pay out dividends to the workers of said companies. Now, it's difficult to speculate on what the specific implications of this proposal would be, as we lack details, such as what size is large enough to mandate participation in this, or what amount would be the minimum required contribution to the fund. Would there be incentives for corporations to contribute more, or punishment for contributing less? All those questions still need to be answered, and I'll most definitely be making another video when they are. However, we do know enough to make a few observations. While this plan is pretty radical, it is not unheard of. In the 1970s, there was a similar plan known as the Bidler Plan in Sweden. In that case, the shares would be contributed to a fund controlled by industry unions with the intention that these funds would grow gradually until the private sector was subsumed by said funds. As you can imagine, there was significant private sector opposition to this plan, and it was watered down and eventually defeated. Another version of this plan is being proposed in the UK by the Labour Party, but in that case the fund size would be targeted at 10% of a given firm, alongside other differences. I'll likely go further in depth in these two programs in other videos. Additionally, plans to encourage employee ownership of companies exist already to one extent. Obviously, there are cooperatives which are just purely owned by the workers. There also are these things called ESOPs, or employee share ownership plans. Employee ownership plans are pretty marginal in their economic effect, but they actually see some bipartisan support across America. This being the context of my favorite Reagan quotes.
I can't help but believe that in the future we'll see in the United States and throughout the Western world an increasing trend toward the next logical step, employee ownership.
Admittedly, however, what Bernie is proposing is very different, if only because these contributions would be required rather than simply optional or even just incentivized. This is a direct attack on wealth inequality, rather than simply a roundabout way to attack wealth inequality, or an anti-poverty measure, or an income inequality measure. Many of us have seen those charts that track productivity growth and wage growth over the years, observing that around the 70s there was a major decoupling of productivity increases and wage increases, which have since leveled out. Proceeds from these productivity increases did not, however, disappear into thin air. They went into the value of corporations and ultimately into the hands of the wealthiest shareholders. By directly ensuring that workers are guaranteed shares in their workplaces, wealth inequality is directly undermined. There are many beneficial consequences that stem from this, but cannot really be explored until this plan is properly fleshed out with details. This proposal, insofar as similar things have been pulled, appears to be popularly accepted across the United States. As I noted, it is hard to determine some of these things due to the fact that this proposal has yet to have been fully fleshed out, but a recent poll is promising. A YouGov poll asked if people support requiring companies to gradually transfer half of their equity. This is 50% of the value of a company we're talking about here into worker-controlled ownership funds that would pay a dividend. This received 55% support, with 20% in opposition. One might say that this proposal has yet to be smeared, but it is also before this proposal has been even properly advocated for. Intelligent political marketing could even increase support for such a proposal, and this is a model that would aim to have half of participating corporations be gradually owned, which is even beyond what's being proposed by the Labour Party in the United Kingdom. The New York Magazine article makes the argument that this plan, even though it is straight-up redistribution of wealth, is likely to be perceived as more moderate to voters than tax increases. The reason being that this proposal is a transfer of ownership directly from bosses, so to speak, to the workers, rather than up through the government and back down to workers, sidestepping skepticism of the federal government. Now, from all this, one might consider this an excellent plan. I tend to agree, as a starting point. However, there are significant problems with it that I'd like to address. Note again that, as I said, it will be difficult to make specific criticisms of how this might play out in practice, such as what the response the wealthy would have to this proposal. However, there is one major criticism I can make based on what we know so far about it. Jim Kessler of the centrist think tank Third Way made the beginnings of a substantive and even progressive critique of this proposal. He pointed out that these employee ownership funds would do little to help labor that is contracted to a given company. Specifically, he mentioned custodial or food service workers. Additionally, one must consider that companies are already moving towards converting as much of their workforce into temp work positions as possible. This could even serve as a means to attempt to dodge the fund. The first responses that come to mind in regards to this issue, however, are largely incorrect. One response is simply cutting down on temp work labor through regulations, which is an admirable position which I address in my employment precarity video where I grudgingly disagree. Another response is that there's no problem here, as whichever company is contracting out this labor is presumably also in the position of having paid into an employee ownership fund. This is a faulty response, and I will explain that here. An Oxford study has found that around 2/3 of income inequality that exists in the United States comes down to inequality between companies, with a third being defined within companies. To put it simply, people who work in companies with higher values would, inevitably, end up being paid more than those who worked in companies with lower values. So, even if that contracted food service worker is getting paid by an employee fund dividend, the inequality they face is probably going to be going largely unaddressed. There's a chance, in fact, that this would end up making certain stratification within the working class even stronger, as presumably these employee-influenced firms are likely to use their control to fortify their position in the higher value strata, even at the expense of the economy as a whole. This is all very much connected to a huge critique I have of cooperatives and decentralized or libertarian models of social ownership in general that I will definitely be addressing in a future video, as the issues I have with it do not end there. There is a simple enough way to address the problem of inequality between firms as it pertains to employee ownership funds, and the Vox article mentions it, and that solution is to make the shares from an employee fund contribute to a larger social wealth fund that everyone would receive a dividend out of at a federal level. I happen to believe that is the ideal solution, for reasons beyond addressing inequality, which, again, I'll address another time. Of course, there is a criticism that is made against the solution that I will partially address here. That would be the fact that people might rather have the feeling of owning a share specifically in their workplace, rather than a share in a larger, more nebulous blob of companies. They want to have more control at their workplace. They want to have their contributions directly rewarded. To that, I have another simple solution. You see that aforementioned co-determination policy, where workers get representatives on the board of directors? That is your means of control over the company, and that control can be used to reward oneself by using it to secure higher wages, performance bonuses, and other benefits. Despite these criticisms, we must remember again that this is a proposal that is in the process of being developed, and should it ever be implemented, the details would go even further on the transformation. Altogether, I see it as an encouraging sign to see the emergence of this proposal, and the fact that it gets to the root of inequality, and the fact that it seems palpable to the average person, and also that it appears to be at least just as achievable as any other major progressive proposal. That'll be it for now. Consider liking and sharing this video, and also subscribing to my channel and clicking the notification bell in order to be alerted when my next video comes out.